What if I told you that the Vatican's greatest fear was not the devil, but the ancient gods of Egypt? For centuries, Osiris, Isis, and Ra cast long shadows over Rome's power, whispering truths older than Christianity itself. These gods offered salvation without priests, justice without fear, and resurrection long before the Gospels. If you're fascinated by hidden histories, forbidden myths, and the secrets that empires tried to bury, you're in the right place. Welcome to Tales Mythology, where ancient legends come alive, and the past speaks again. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell, so you never miss another journey into the mysteries of mythology. Imagine stepping into the hushed corridors of the Vatican. The air is thick, perfumed with incense and candle wax, yet strangely heavious, though centuries of secrets have settled into the stone itself. You can almost hear it, whispers fluttering between marble pillars, murmurs too soft to distinguish, but unmistakably alive. Now, if I asked you, what was the Church's greatest fear? Your instinct might leap immediately to the devil, the great adversary, the horned deceiver lurking in shadows. After all, every sermon, every medieval fresco, every fiery homily painted him as the embodiment of danger to the Christian soul. And yet history, when listened to carefully, tells another story, one that doesn't fit neatly into stained glass depictions of hellfire. Behind the Vatican's closed doors, in the quiet discussions of popes, bishops, and scholars, a far older fear persisted, not of demons, not even of Satan himself. The fear was of gods older than Christianity, gods who had ruled entire civilizations long before the first gospel was ever written. Gods whose images were carved not in dark corners, but in radiant stone, still standing tall against the desert sun. The gods of ancient Egypt, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Ra. And here is the paradox that startles us even now. While the Church officially called them false idols or diabolical deceptions, in its private heart, it trembled at something else entirely. What if these gods were not simply vanquished relics, but eternal voices that could outshine the Christian message? This is the story of that fear, not a fear of evil, but a fear of competition of ideas that could survive beyond suppression, that could thrive in symbols, rituals, and myths embedded too deeply in human imagination to be erased. So today, let us walk softly into this tension, past the cathedrals and mosaics, beneath the vaults and archives, into the layered struggle where the Vatican tried not just to defeat, but to absorb, silence, and outlast the gods of Egypt. Welcome, dear listener, to a tale where mythology and theology collide in fiery battle, but in subtler wars of memory, imagery, and belief. To understand why the Vatican felt so unsettled, we must picture the world in which Christianity rose. The Roman Empire was not a spiritual vacuum waiting to be filled. Far from it. It was a mosaic of belief systems, each ancient, deeply ingrained, and tied to civic life. And among all these, Egypt's faith stood apart. Egypt was a civilization whose gods had walked alongside humanity for thousands of years. They weren't abstract figures scribbled in rare manuscripts. They were living presences, woven into every layer of society. The Nile did not simply irrigate crops. It was a sacred artery of divine rhythm. The rising and setting of the sun wasn't just natural, it was Ra himself, crossing the heavens in his solar bark. Pharaohs were not merely political rulers. They were manifestations of divinity, bridging heaven and earth. Every law, every harvest, every death ritual was intertwined with the gods. Even medicine, astronomy, and architecture bore the fingerprints of divine order. Now, imagine being an early Christian missionary stepping into this world. You're carrying scriptures about sin and salvation through Christ. Yet around you, Egyptians chant hymns to Isis with voices that echo across stone temples taller than any basilica you have ever seen. Priests of Amun preside over estates larger than entire dioceses. Festivals flood the streets with music and incense. This wasn't ignorance waiting to be corrected. This was a civilization with its own profound spiritual system, older than Rome itself. And that was the Vatican's dilemma. If Christianity offered salvation through Christ alone, what happens when people look at Osiris, god of resurrection, and see a story that predates the Gospels by centuries? If salvation comes through the cross, what happens when Egyptians point to Mat, the principle of truth and cosmic order, which required no priest, no confessor only, that one's heart be lighter than a feather in the scales of eternity? For the Church, this wasn't just a theological quibble, it was existential. The devil, in the Christian imagination, was always framed as a corrupter, a fallen angel. His role was to twist and deceive. But Egyptian gods, they weren't tempters. They weren't caricatures of evil. They were alternative sources of meaning, justice, and hope. And herein lay the real fear, that people might find peace, justice, and eternal life without needing the Church at all. One medieval chronicler confessed, with striking honesty, fear of damnation is the shepherd's hook. If men no longer fear, they no longer follow. Think about that. The Church's authority did not rest solely on rituals or beauty, but on its ability to command moral urgency, to say, without us, your soul is lost. But what if Egyptian religion suggested otherwise? What if, instead of fearing damnation, people believed their souls were weighed simply by their deeds, by the harmony they brought into the world? The Vatican's greatest nightmare was not chaos, but confidence, that people might live in peace with cosmic balance without ever bowing before Rome's altar. And so, the struggle began it against the devil, but against a pantheon of gods, whose entrance challenged Christianity's claim to universality. This was a war fought, not only in sermons, but in mosaics, symbols, and even silence. A war not of swords, but of stories. Picture yourself standing in a cathedral. Sunlight pours through stained glass windows, scattering colors like shards of a rainbow across the stone floor. You lift your gaze to a mosaic high above the altar, where saints are depicted with luminous halos glowing around their heads. To the medieval worshipper, these halos symbolized holiness, divine light, but to the eyes of an Egyptian, they would have looked eerily familiar. The halo resembled not just a Christian innovation, but the solar disk of Ra, ancient sun god, who sailed across the sky daily in his bark of light. This is where the Vatican's genius lay, not in open confrontation, but in subtle transformation. They didn't always erase, they absorbed. The ankh, the Egyptian symbol of life, became reimagined as the Christian cross. What had once represented the eternal breath of the gods was now reframed as salvation through Christ's sacrifice. The mother and child imagery of Isis, tenderly cradling the infant Horus, was quietly echoed in depictions of Mary and the baby Jesus, and the solemn posture of Osiris, seated on his throne of judgment, reappeared in portrayals of saints enthroned in majesty. The strategy was deliberate. By wrapping Egyptian symbols in Christian narratives, the Church redirected devotion without directly destroying the past. It was a quiet war of symbols, fought not with swords, but with mosaics, carvings, and stained glass. My reflection: I sometimes wonder about the people who first walked into those churches and recognized the resemblance. Did they whisper to themselves, "This looks like what I once knew"? Did they feel comforted that their old gods hadn't vanished, only changed names? Or did they feel betrayed, realizing that what was sacred to them had been repurposed for another faith? This wasn't theft, it was conquest through assimilation, and conquest of the imagination is often more powerful than conquest of land. But here we reach a delicate question. Was this assimilation an act of respect, or of appropriation? On one hand, one could argue that the Church acknowledged the beauty and power of Egyptian imagery. By weaving it into Christian art, it kept those ancient forms alive, ensuring they were not lost to time. On the other hand, it was a rebranding that stripped away original meanings. The ankh no longer spoke of cosmic life, it was recast as the triumph of the crucifixion. Isis's motherhood was no longer about the divine feminine, it was subordinated to Marian devotion. This tension between embrace and erasure exists everywhere cultures meet, and it raises profound questions. When we adopt symbols from other traditions, Do we honor them or hollow them out? Can a symbol carry two meanings at once? Or does the louder narrative always overwrite the quieter one? I once visited a cathedral in southern Spain, built over the ruins of a mosque, which itself had been built over a Roman temple. As I walked through its arches, I saw layers of history stacked on top of each other: Roman columns, Islamic calligraphy, Christian frescoes. Each culture had tried to overwrite the last, yet none could fully erase what came before. The result was a palimpsest-layered story of conquest, survival, and adaptation. That cathedral made me think of Egypt. Perhaps the Vatican never truly destroyed the gods of the Nile. It simply tried to overwrite them, trusting that over time, people would forget the original meanings. And yet symbols are stubborn things. They carry echoes, whispers, resonances that defy full control. Symbols have a way of slipping through the cracks. You may silence a god's name, but you cannot always silence the feeling a symbol evokes. Think of the mother cradling her child. Whether it is Isis with Horus or Mary with Jesus, the image stirs something universal: the protective embrace of love, the promise of continuity, the tenderness of beginnings. People don't always need theology to feel the power of that image. Or think of the rising sun. To Egyptians, it was Ri's triumph over darkness. To Christians, it became a metaphor for resurrection and divine glory. But in either case, when you stand bathed in dawn's first light, your spirit lifts instinctively. The symbol transcends the story attached to it. Real-life story. Years ago, while traveling through Italy, I stepped into a small rural church. The stained glass window above the altar caught my eye. Its colors amber, scarlet, sapphire formed a radiant circle around a central figure. I couldn't explain why, but I felt an almost Egyptian pull in that imagery. Later, I learned that the window had been modeled after ancient solar motifs, brought into Christian art centuries earlier. At that moment, I realized I had responded not to the Christian narrative, but to the universal language of light. This is why the Vatican's struggle was never complete. You can rename a symbol, but you cannot fully control what it awakens in the human heart. Transition. By the time assimilation had run its course, Egyptian motifs had been painted into the very walls of Christendom. Suns bore the pastures of Osiris. Halos glowed like the sun. Marian tenderness mirrored Isis's eternal embrace. The Church may have thought it was conquering Egyptian imagery, but in truth, it was also carrying those gods forward, silent, rebranded, but still alive in memory. Yet, even as symbols lived on, another question awed at the Vatican's authority. What if the theology itself, stories, the afterlife, the cosmic order survived beneath the surface? That takes us to the next stage of our story: the hidden archives, the forbidden studies, and the dangerous secrecy that define the Vatican's battle with Egypt's gods. Imagine a heavy oak door deep beneath the Vatican. Its hinges groan as it opens, revealing a dimly lit chamber. Rows of shelves stretch into shadow, each stacked with scrolls, parchments, and bound codices. A single candle flickers on a desk, where a monk bends low over an ancient papyrus, his finger pressed to his lips, as if to hush even the whisper of knowledge. This was not a library in the modern sense. It was a fortress of silence. The Vatican did not destroy every Egyptian text it seized. Instead, many were hidden. Papyruses bearing hymns to Thoth, fragments of Osiris's mysteries, astronomical charts used in Egyptian temples. These did not vanish into flames. They were locked away in vaults, guarded not by soldiers, but by secrecy. Why? Because knowledge itself was dangerous. The Church feared that, if ordinary believers had access to Egyptian cosmology, they might begin to ask unsettling questions. If Osiris rose before Christ, what makes Christ unique? If Matt offers cosmic justice without priests, why submit to confession? By restricting access, the Vatican ensured that only a select circle of scholars could study these works, and even those scholars were carefully monitored. Their job was not to admire Egyptian wisdom, but to refute it, to strip it of spiritual authority, while preserving enough knowledge to combat it. Personal reflection. This reminds me of how some governments today ban books, not because the words themselves are violent, but because they plant seeds of thought. A dangerous idea is often more unsettling than any physical threat. The Vatican's treatment of Egyptian texts was not about archaeology, it was about controlling imagination. To guard spiritual monopoly, they built walls of silence. But silence is never permanent. Fast forward to 1799. Napoleon's troops march across the Egyptian sands, their boots sinking into a land of forgotten monuments. One day, near the town of Rosetta, a group of soldiers uncovers a massive black stone, half buried in the earth. The Rosetta Stone. Inscribed on its surface were the same decree in 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and Egyptian hieroglyphs. Suddenly, for the first time in centuries, the key to unlocking Egypt's lost language was in human hands. The Vatican's long-maintained silence began to crack. What had been confined to whispering vaults now entered public discourse. Scholars like Jean-François Champollion would eventually decipher the hieroglyphs, giving voice to gods and myths that had been silent for over 1,000 years. Imagine the shock. Ancient hymns to Ra printed in European newspapers, Osiris's story circulating in salons, Isis's prayers studied in universities. What had been hidden for centuries was now alive in the open. My commentary. I see this as a universal truth. Knowledge wants to be free. The more tightly you clutch it, the more inevitable its escape becomes. Like water, it seeps through cracks, finds channels, and eventually floods the world. For the Vatican, the Rosetta Stone was not just an archaeological discovery. It was a breach in the dam of secrecy. The old gods were speaking again. With the rise of the printing press and later mass publishing, Egyptian theology could no longer be contained. What once took monks hours to copy by hand could now be printed in thousands of copies and shipped across Europe. This democratization of knowledge changed everything. Suddenly, Egyptian ideas were not the private study of a handful of theologians, they were accessible to philosophers, artists, and even ordinary readers. The Vatican tried to adapt. It shifted its rhetoric, insisting that Egyptian religion was fascinating but ultimately primitive, a beautiful cultural artifact, not a living truth. Yet the very fact that they needed to reframe it showed how much they had lost control. Real-life parallel. Think of the internet today. Once information is online, it spreads beyond containment. Authorities can label, discredit, or censor, but they cannot erase. The Rosetta Stone was the 18th century equivalent of going viral. Egypt's gods, once silenced, were suddenly trending. Letters from Vatican officials of the time reveal a subtle anxiety. They understood that the more people read Egyptian myths, the harder it became to maintain the narrative that Christianity was utterly unique. And so the struggle shifted. No longer a battle of suppression, it became a battle of interpretation. Transition. The Vatican had survived by hiding Egyptian wisdom in silence, but when silence broke through the Rosetta Stone, through print, through public fascination, they had to find new ways to maintain control. They could not destroy the gods of Egypt, but they could reframe them not as rivals, but as precursors, beautiful but obsolete. That is where we turn next, to Section 4, Reframing Ancient Power, where Egyptian motifs reappeared, not just in books, but in city squares, monuments, and even in Rome itself. Semites claimed as trophies, sometimes whispered as reminders. Transition from fear to framing. By the time the Rosetta Stone had been deciphered, the Vatican realized something profound. The battle of suppression was over. Egyptian gods were out in the open again, and the world was listening. But here's the subtle genius of power: it doesn't always fight head-on. Sometimes it bends, sometimes it reframes. So, the church adopted a new stance. Egyptian religion, they began to say, was not evil, it was incomplete, a foreshadowing, a primitive attempt at truth that Christianity had ultimately perfected. Osiris, yes, a noble figure, but only a shadow of Christ. Mat, yes, a beautiful principle of balance, but insufficient compared to divine grace. Isis, a tender mother, yes, but only a pale echo of Mary, who was greater. This narrative allowed the Vatican to acknowledge Egypt's grandeur without surrendering supremacy. It was a clever maneuver to tame admiration by turning it into validation. See, they could say, even the Egyptians were reaching for Christ without knowing it. Personal reflection. I think about how, in our own lives, we sometimes reinterpret what once frightened us. When an old fear returns, we soothe ourselves by saying, it was never really a threat, it was just a stepping stone. The Vatican's reframing of Egypt was exactly that, not erasing the past, but redefining it as a prelude. Yet, beneath the surface, the old anxiety remained, because if Egyptian myths could prefigure Christianity, might they also suggest that Christianity was not unique, but part of a much older pattern? That question haunted scholars more than they admitted. The living shadows. Walk through the heart of Rome today, and you will see them. Obelisks rising in public squares, their hieroglyphs carved 3,000 years ago, their stones hauled from the Nile to the Tiber. One stands in front of St. Peter's Basilica itself, once dedicated to the sun god Ra. It now bears a Christian cross at its summit. To the public, it is a trophy, a sign that Christianity has conquered paganism, that the stones of Egypt now serve the church. But to the initiated, the irony is almost unbearable. The obelisk still bears prayers to Ra, still carries Egypt's voice, even as it casts its shadow across the Vatican's heart. Story. I remember standing in St. Peter's Square for the first time, gazing up at that towering obelisk. Tourists snapped photos without knowing what they were looking at. To most, it was just Roman architecture. But when I leaned closer, I could see the faint hieroglyphs etched into its sides. Suddenly, I felt as though I was in two worlds at once, a Catholic capital and an Egyptian temple, superimposed. The stone remembered its first master, and that's the paradox of symbols. You can crown them with new meaning, but you cannot strip away their origin. The obelisks whisper even now, silently reminding us that Christianity grew not in isolation, but in the long shadow of older gods. Modern resonance, ancient echoes. Even beyond Rome, Egypt's presence stretched into Europe's imagination. During the Renaissance, artists and philosophers, emboldened by rediscovered texts, began weaving Egyptian motifs into their work. The Hermetic writings, attributed to a figure blending Hermes and Thoth, inspired thinkers in medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. The Inquisition, alarmed, tried to suppress this resurgence, but the allure of Egypt was too strong. To Renaissance minds, it wasn't a relic of superstition, it was a source of wisdom, a glimpse of humanity's ancient grasp of cosmic order. And here is the strange truth. Even as the Vatican tried to frame Egypt as outdated, scholars, mystics, and even popes themselves were captivated by its beauty. Letters survive of cardinals quietly admitting admiration for Egyptian myths, even as they condemn them in sermons. Reflection. This duality fascinates me. Publicly, power must project certainty, but privately, even those in authority feel what they cannot fully explain. I imagine a Renaissance cardinal standing before a papyrus hymn to Osiris, secretly moved, even as he signs a decree banning its public reading. Human beings are rarely as simple as their official stances. By the 19th century, Egypt's return was undeniable. Obelisks stood not only in Rome, but in Paris, London, and New York. Their hieroglyphs, once mute, were now legible to anyone willing to learn. What had been silenced became accessible. What had been feared became fashionable. And yet even in fashion, something deeper stirred. Because these were not dead symbols, they were living echoes. Transition. By reframing Egyptian gods as precursors, the Vatican tried to tame their influence. By erecting obelisks crowned with crosses, it tried to claim victory. But the truth is more complicated. For every halo painted in gold, the sun still glowed. For every Madonna holding Christ, Isis still cradled Horus. For every obelisk crowned with a cross, the hieroglyphs whispered prayers to gods older than Rome itself. The Vatican had won the political battle, but the gods of Egypt had survived in silence, in symbols, in shadows. And so, As we move into the final chapter, we must ask, what is the lesson of this struggle? What can we, in our own time, learn from the Vatican's fear of ancient gods? That is where we turn next. Section 5, Reflections, Lessons and Takeaway. Why this story matters. Why linger so long on the Vatican's fear of Egyptian gods? Why does it matter to us now, centuries later? It matters because this story is not just about religion. It is about the power of ideas, how they travel, how they endure, and how they cannot be erased by decree or force. The Church feared Egyptian theology because it was evil, but because it was resilient, because it offered people a way to make sense of life and death, of justice and balance, without needing a gatekeeper. That independence was the true danger. History shows us that ideas older than empires can survive the fall of temples, the silence of vaults, even the condemnation of pulpits. Egyptian gods outlived the pharaohs. They outlived Rome. They even outlived centuries of being branded false. Why? Because they spoke to something universal in the human imagination. Personal reflection. I believe every culture carries symbols that never fully die. They are seeds buried deep in memory. Suppress them, and they go dormant. But give them light, and they sprout again. That is what happened when the Rosetta Stone was uncovered. Egypt's seeds bloomed once more, centuries after being buried. This matters because we live in a world where stories still compete. Unlike the Vatican centuries ago, institutions still fear ideas that empower people to think outside official frameworks. Lessons for today. So what lessons can we take from this long, subtle war between the Vatican and the gods of Egypt? 1. Ideas cannot be irrationally reframed. The Church tried silence, then assimilation, then reinterpretation. Yet Osiris still stands beside Christ in cultural memory. The lesson: suppression rarely works. Ideas adapt, transform, and survive. 2. Symbols are more powerful than words. Ankh or cross, sun disk or halathese images bypass logic and reach the heart. Power often lies not in arguments, but in the symbols that move us. 3. Fear often masks admiration. When institutions fear a rival idea, it is often because they secretly recognize its strength. The Vatican's obsession with Egypt betrayed a kind of reluctant awe. 4. Balance versus control. Matt taught harmony, a cosmic balance achieved by truth. The Church taught obedience, salvation through authority. The contrast reminds us of a timeless question: do we live best under fear or under balance? Personal story. Years ago, I visited Luxor in Egypt. Standing before the massive columns of Karnak Temple, I felt overwhelmed. The carvings stretched high into the sky, their stories of gods and kings still visible after thousands of years. Later, in Rome, I stood before St. Peter's Basilica, equally overwhelming, equally majestic, and I realized these two worlds, often portrayed as enemies, were speaking the same language: literature, ritual, symbol. Each claimed universality, each tried to outlast the other, but in truth, both survive, side by side, in our memory. That is the greatest lesson. No story fully dies. They layer, intertwine, and shape us even when we are unaware. Closing resonance. So, why did the Vatican fear the Egyptian gods more than the devil? Because the devil was a tempter, an enemy they could define, oppose, and control. But Egypt's gods were something else entirely. They were alternatives. They offered salvation, justice, and order without the Church. They were living proof that humanity had sought meaning long before Rome, long before Christianity, and that truth was more frightening than any demon. As we close, I invite you to reflect. Next time you see a cross, a halo, or even an obelisk rising in a city square, pause, look closely, listen quietly. Beneath the Christian story, you may hear an older voice whispering Isis, Osiris, trembled, that faith is not a straight line, but a river with many tributaries. The past is never gone. It lingers in symbols, in stories, in the stones beneath our feet. Power may try to silence it, but memory has a voice of its own. So let us not fear the old gods, nor dismiss them. Let us see them as companions on humanity's long search for truth, and perhaps, in their echoes, we find not rivals to our beliefs, but reminders of our shared longing for meaning. The gods of Egypt have not vanished. They wait, and in their waiting, they teach us nothing sacred is ever truly lost.